and he said, most of them know me already. But tonight our guest is Reverend Arthur Schwenk. He has been at Trinity, correct, high school for some time and lived in the area for quite some years as well. And so it is our joy to welcome Pastor Schwenk.
Thank you so much, Pastor Sorensen. It's a delight to be here. Can you hear me back there? If not, raise your hand and wave at me, and I'll try to speak louder. As an old teacher, I have a tendency to project anyway, so I hope you can hear me. This is a joy to be here, to celebrate, help you celebrate the history of your church. What we're going to do focus on mostly is the path of immigration that came from Europe to this area. And so the presentation this evening involves 4 aspects to it. How many of you saw the film Gone with the Wind? Oh my goodness. Remember how long that was? You're in for another version. Okay. Remember how when you got to the intermission you thought it was over? And it was just half over? Or we'll try not to keep it that long. But we will move through a lot of statistics tonight, and I hope it's not too boring for you. The 4th phase will be immigration into this area in Bartholomew County. So hang on, we'll get there, especially when we get to the part about the history of our church here. All right, now, let's see here. Oops.
Oh, yeah, slide that. Yep.
Yeah. It's called German migration in the 19th and 20th centuries, because most of the people who came into this area came in the 1800s. Some in the 1900s, but mostly in the 1800s. Not moving. You need a technician here. There we go. Okay. Our first section will be on departure from the old world. By old world, I'm talking about Europe. Second will be the voyage itself. What was it like to come as an immigrant? What was the trip like? You know how taxing it is when you go to the airport, you go through the customs and all that? It's nothing compared to what it was. Okay. Then we'll talk about arrival in the new world. And then finally about migration into Bartholomew County. Can you see? All right. Let's look at the different types of European migration. We tend to think of everybody coming here. That didn't happen necessarily. There were different types. We see, first of all, there were the transatlantic migration. That's the ones that your ancestors came on. They crossed the Atlantic coming here to the New World. Then there were short distance movements. Those were generally within Europe, primarily because of shifting political borders, wars, battles, and things like that. Things were unsettled in Europe, and as people moved then from one area to another, but it was intercontinental. And in 1763, Catherine the Great invited Germans to come to Russia to help settle there. And to this day, some of those who migrated to Russia still live there, and there are German communities in Russia today. And this type of short distance migrations were the most common kind. They were mostly forced by the state, governments, or they may have been for religious persecution, as in the case of the Moravians who came to Hope, Indiana, or for political beliefs. And then there were temporary migrations, when people would move from one area to another with the intention of going back home. The people who came here usually did not intend to go back home. Now, if you want to look at the cover of this front page on here, I want to show you this. And I love this picture. If you go to Germany and you want to do some research or you're interested in history and migration, you must go to Bremerhaven. Bremerhaven is up there. I can't reach it. There's Bremen. Bremerhaven's up there. And it's out on the sea, on the coast. And most of the people who came here came through Bremen, on out to Bremerhaven, and then came here. When you get to Bremerhaven today, there's a great migration museum. Have you been there? You have? Oh, isn't it wonderful?
It's amazing.
It's amazing. It's the best museum that I've ever seen, the way it's portrayed. Especially that when you come around the corner and you see the big ship, you feel like you're there, don't you? Yeah, it's amazing. But outside the building, and you go out on the coast, you see this statue, and it's right on the water. I love this because here you have the father of a family, arms stretched out, looking towards the sea, looking for opportunity. An opportunity to go for better employment, for a future that doesn't exist at home. And what's mom doing? She's comforting the little child in front of her, and she's looking back, knowing that she'll never see her family again. To me, this just captures that feeling. You're torn between opportunity and leaving your family. So go to Bremerhaven. It's terrific. Okay. Now, what are some of the results of long-term migrations? Well, one of the results was that if they settled in an urban area, like New York, Boston, whatever, or Berlin, whatever, the children usually assimilated very quickly. And we see that even here in Bartholomew County today with the migrants who are coming. The children play with one another, they go to school, they learn the language, where the older people have more difficulty assimilating into the culture and the language. In the rural areas, however, linguistic and religious pockets survive for centuries. And we see that right here in this church. It wasn't for centuries, but when did the church get founded? Remember?
1871.
1871. When did they start speaking English in the church? Do you know? 1842. It wasn't for 50 years. Yeah. They were here for 50 years before they were using English in the services here. That's 50 years. You go to Walmart today and people say, oh, what, they learn the language here? They're here now. They've been here, what, 2 years? Hey, your ancestors were here for 50 years before they were speaking English, some of them. All right. It takes a long time. And customs, too. For example, you go to Hope today. The people in Hope are very proud of their heritage, and they came from Moravia. Moravia is the section of land that was between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And they were driven out of that territory to Germany, and then eventually came to America. Well, they brought with them a lot of customs. If you go to Hope today, have you ever been there through Christmas time, and you drive through Hope, and you see these multi-pointed white stars? That's a custom they brought with them. That indicates that there's a Christian living in that home. Yeah. If you go there for Easter sunrise service, well, there's a band that goes around, a brass band that goes around Hope. They used to walk. Now they go around on a flatbed truck. And they play very early in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock, to get you up so you can go to sunrise service. That's a custom they brought with them. Then if you go to the sunrise service, what do? They start in the church, and then they walk out to the old part of the cemetery and have a sunrise service out there, where the stones are flat, not upright like in your cemetery over here, but lying flat with a little garden area in front of them. That's a custom they brought with them. Now, of course, you go to the modern part of the cemetery, and they're just like they are today. But they still have those customs. And those kinds of things have existed in religious pockets throughout the United States. Now, in the 19th century, the urbanization was taking place in Europe. Now, look at this. London increased in the 19th century by 340%. Grew 3 times its size in 100 years. Oops. I gotta go back. How do I go back? Push this? Yeah. Okay. There we go. Whoa. Oh.
Hit the other arrow.
The other?
Yep.
Just going forward. Okay, there we go. Paris increased by 345%. Vienna increased by 490%, almost 5 times its size in 100 years. Okay. And look at Berlin, 872%, almost 9 times its size in 100 years. That's amazing. In 1800 to 1914, Germany grew from 2 major cities. That was Berlin and Hamburg. But it grew to over 45 big cities. There was a mass movement taking place from the rural areas to the cities. In 1867, 2/3 of the people lived in the countryside. But in 1912, 2/3 lived in towns, and only 1/3 lived out in the countryside. From 1830, 90% of those who immigrated came to the United States. 10% of those who immigrated went to Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and South America. South Africa, excuse me. Now, there were different phases of transatlantic immigration. Before 1865, they were mainly independent peasants and artisans. Now, if you look in the dictionary, the word peasant, it'll probably say farmer. It's not the same thing. A farmer indicates that they own the land. Peasants did not own the land. They worked for somebody else. They were like tenant farmers of some sort. They mostly traveled in family groups, and that's what we saw coming into this area here. Most of those who came first were family groups. But 1865 to 1895, more people came as individuals. And part of that was because those who were already here would write back to their brothers, their cousins, their neighbors, and say, "Come on over." And so a lot of single guys would come over, even single women came as individuals. They mostly came from the rural and the poor areas of northern Germany. Almost everybody who came into this part of the country came from northern Germany. And they spoke then Plattdeutsch, or Low German. Post-Civil War, after the Civil War, there was the Homestead Act of 1864, and people could come on over, go out west, and they could stake out a claim, put up some sort of a shelter on it. Didn't have to be a house, but a shelter of some sort. For 5 years, that they could own the land. They could not do that in Germany. They could not own the land. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In the 1880s, almost all the land here in this area had been taken, and out west, almost all of it had been taken. Now, 1895 to 1914, in other words, World War I, many individual men and women came from all parts of the German-speaking countries. I said before, most of the people who were coming were from northern Germany. Well, now they were coming from southern Germany. They were coming from Austria, Switzerland, and the Eastern European countries as well. And they came from, and they hoped to earn a living here in the United States. It wasn't for political reasons, but mostly for economic reasons. In the cities, people who settled in the cities, they became laborers because the Industrial Revolution had started in England, and this was a major factor because in England, they developed the loom. The weaving industry was very important to weave cloth, and that was a major home cottage industry in northern Germany. And if you go in any of these homes here, and you go in, like in a room like that, you'll see a loom. Almost every big home had a loom, and people would weave the cloth they needed for their clothing in the house during the winter time. Well, with the Industrial Revolution starting up in England, that more or less put the weaving industry out of business in northern Germany. They couldn't compete. All right. In the rural areas, there were fewer settlement opportunities here because all the land was already purchased. So they could come and they could find jobs, but they couldn't buy land to create a farm or whatever. And the poorest of the people generally stayed in the big cities because that's where factories were starting up in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, there were some people who came, but they were disenchanted, or they were homesick, or they earned a lot of money here, and they could go back home and live a higher standard of living because they could take their money back with them. And so a number of people went back, and that was called return migration. A lot of people did that. Where did they come from? Well, look at this. They came from every place in Europe, especially the top row, Germany, Italy, Britain, and Ireland. If you look on the back side of this, you'll see these figures represent where the immigrants came from. And by and large, it was very clear there were more Germans than any others who came to America. Then there were Italians, Britons, and Brits and Irish. Now, preparing for departure, that was a major thing. Number one, to decide we're going to leave home, we're going to leave our family, so what do you have to do? So they had to hire wagoners, they bought carts, they bought horses, and they banded together for protection and to help each other get along. Major gathering points before transatlantic departure were in Paris, and Strasbourg, France, Basel, Switzerland, and then all the rest there, Cologne, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Mainz, and Berlin were in Germany. That's where they would gather and form groups to come together. Rivers to depart were the Rhine, the Seine, and the Weser. Most of the people who came here went up the Weser, W-E-S-E-R, the Weser, and they came. The Weser comes right up to Bremen and to Bremerhaven, and then they would sail out of there. Cities of departure were, on the Atlantic side, we have Le Havre, and in France, Antwerp, Belgium, and Rotterdam, the Netherlands. In the North Sea, we had Hamburg, Bremen, and Bremerhaven, and in Great Britain, London and Liverpool. Some of them skipped over the English Channel, and so they could sail out of England because it was cheaper. But that was also a complication just to get across the English Channel, and so most didn't do that, even though they could. Then, southern ports after 1880 were from Genoa and Naples. By the way, I mentioned up here that on the Atlantic side we have Le Havre. Have you seen what's happening 3 days from now? Has anybody seen the news? What's happening out of Le Havre in 3 days? It's big news. None of you? France is giving us a Statue of Liberty. Another one. You did see it. They're coming, but it's only 10 feet tall. Yeah. But they're sailing in 3 days out of Le Havre, and it's coming to New York. It's going to be put on Ellis Island for about 4 days, and then it's going to be going to Washington, D.C., and will be located on at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. Yeah, so it's a symbol of our friendship and ongoing relationships with France. All right. Now, until the middle of the 1850s, the majority of German immigrants left from non-German ports, especially from Le Havre. That was prior to the, but those who came here mostly came from northern Germany, not through Le Havre. After 1855, Bremen, Bremerhaven, and Hamburg became the most important reports of their hardship. After 1890, most immigrants came from Eastern and Southeastern Europe. We'll see some in a minute, another factor about that wasn't positive. Now, every time there was an improvement, it meant it was a big factor for immigration. One thing was the reduction of customs, the barriers in each state. You see, up until 1871, there was no Germany as we know it today. There were over 400 little kingdoms in what we know of Germany today. And in each of those little kingdoms, somebody was in charge, a duke, a prince, whatever. And they charged taxes. And so when you went from one state to another, you had to pay a tax, a duty. It's like when we went to Canada, and we came back, my wife and I had bought sleeping bags in Canada. And we came back in the United States, and you know what? We had to pay a duty on those sleeping bags because they were filled with down. There was a duty on down. Well, when they, oops, back here. I gotta go back. This is like my computer. It has a mind of its own. Sometimes it talks to me. Yeah. The introduction of steam navigation in the late 1820s was big. It was up until about the 1850s, 1860s. Well, in the 1860s, everything were sailing ships. And so when steam came in, that was big. And it was less grueling, less expensive, and it was a lot shorter time. We'll talk about that in a moment. In 1827, the harbor at Bremerhaven was developed. You see, Bremen here is about 50 miles in from the ocean. And so the large ships could not come clear up to Bremen. They had to stop out here. So when the harbor was developed at Bremerhaven, that was big. Then it was open to barges, and the trip then to get from Bremen out to Bremerhaven was only 2 to 3 days. That was big because it had taken longer than that. In the 1830s and on, we saw the development of the railroads. And with the development of the railroads, that moved things a lot faster. Then it would only take 1.5 to 2 hours to get from Bremen to Bremerhaven, a distance of about 50 miles. There were 3 major, whoops. Now notice this. Prior to the 1860s, all voyages were on sailing ships. And how long did it take to get here? 60 to 70 days. A little over 2 months to sail. Imagine, 2 months on the ocean. They couldn't see land. They'd left their families. They had to take their own food with them on the ships. That was a problem. That was a problem. We'll get to that in a minute. The average crossing time was 60 to 70 days. Okay. There were 3 classes aboard the ships. First class, second class, third class, or steerage. Almost everybody who came was steerage. It's just like on an airplane today. Very similar. Only on an airplane today, you get there a lot quicker. On the steerage deck, everything was communal space. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a picture in here that shows you that. I thought there was a picture. Yeah, if you look here. This picture. Everything was communal. You didn't have any privacy. There was no private rooms. Nothing was private. Everything was communal. The dormitory, dining room, common room, it was all common space. There were no tables, no chairs. Luggage was stored between the bunks. Now remember, they're coming for the rest of their lives. What do you bring with you if you have to bring everything in a trunk? Very minimal. And almost everybody brought their family Bible, some clothes, some cooking pots. But to think, you've got one big trunk that you have to put everything that's important to you in. I'm having challenges here. Okay. There was minimal, the luggage was stored between the bunks. There was minimal light below the deck, poor ventilation. Bunks were stacked too high with 5 persons per bunk. Yeah, and how much space was that? Well, the shipping lines were required to provide a minimum of 14 square feet, 14 square feet per person. That's about a yard, a little bit over a yard, square yard per person. That's not a lot of space to sleep in. And they had 5 people in each little compartment. It was very miserable. They sometimes had to sleep in shifts. In addition to that, there was bad weather and seasickness, which heightened the bad conditions. It was raining or storming on the sea. They couldn't go up on the deck, so they had to stay down below. It was miserable.